name is Ross Astoria. I am a... Are you clapping? Okay. I haven't even done anything yet. For my day job, I'm a professor at UW Parkside, which is the four-year comprehensive in Kenosha, Wisconsin, about 3 hours drive from here. You probably know where that is. I guess right now I'm chair of the Department of Politics, Philosophy, and Law, but in my department that's a not it position, so I wasn't there when the meeting they were voting for the chair, so I couldn't avoid that responsibility. I do a lot of work in what's called public law, and so I end up teaching courses on constitutional law, environmental policy. I do some political theory. And one thing that I was lucky enough to pick up on pretty early is that in New York, they are changing the structure of their utility laws. And they're changing them in just the way I think is required in every state, more or less, in order to make the distributed energy resources that are economically attractive already compatible with the utility structure. So what I'm going to try to do, and I guess I should also say, I had the good fortune to be on sabbatical in the year that New York's Public Service Commission was rolling these out, so I was able to kind of read them all and more or less keep up. So what I'm going to try to do here is do a brief overview of the general structure of that utility reform, and then I'm going to show you something about the Brooklyn-Queens demand side management program that they're running, because to me that seems like from terms of governance and economics, it seems like the way to go about determining what sort of resources to put up instead of or as alternatives to large infrastructure projects. So here we go. Let's see if we can get this thing to click. Do I point it this way? There we go. All right, now first thing I want to talk about here is something called the capital expenditure bias. And this is a bias that's well known to people in the utility industry. And what it means is utilities love to make really big investments in big capital expenditure projects. And then you get people on panels talking about, oh, sunk costs. We got to pay off the sunk cost. And there's capital utility debt. Did I get 10% for that? Okay. Rob says every time I say capital utility debt, I get an extra 10% off my bonus. So a lot of people think the capital expenditure bias is kind of a natural aspect of finance or economics, and in fact it's a product of a particular legal organization. And what happened here in the end of the 19th century, the railroads got really big and really powerful. In the States, in the beginning of the 1880s, mid-1880s, they started establishing these commissions, and these commissions were charged with making sure that the railroads didn't overcharge their customers. And so they were charged with, the commissions said they're supposed to put out rates that are just and reasonable, right? So the commissions are supposed to make sure that the rates charged by the railroad stations are just and reasonable, just like our Public Service Commission is supposed to do with respect to our electrical utility rates. And the fancy lawyers for the railroad companies started going, well, wait a minute, if the rates that we're allowed to charge by the Public Service Commissions are too low, that means there'll be no return on investment for the capitalists. And they started bringing these clever lawsuits under what's called the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment's taking clause says that basically the state cannot take private property except for a public purpose and with just compensation. And in this case, Smith v. Ames, 1898, the Supreme Court ruled that any rates that a Public Service Commission allowed to be charged by railroads had to ensure that capital earned a reasonable rate of return, or else it would be a taking of property. For about 50 years, people fight about what that means, and then this case from 1949 also goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, well, the way you determine what the rate base is you can take all of the capital investments by the utility and you depreciate them. And so what does that mean? If a utility wants to increase its revenues, it's got to at least be refreshing all its capital investments and maybe expanding them. Otherwise, they're kind of going to depreciate out of existence, right? So that is why there's no kind of economic magic here. That is why that capital expenditure bias is why our utilities, their first instinct is to invest in a big capital project. And that leads to three kind of conflicts here with distributed energy resources. So utilities now have this incentive to invest in fixed capital projects. First, the state secures capital's return on investments on those big capital projects, and then other resources, distributed energy resources, efficiency, they are valued secondarily and derivatively. And then the third consequence is the utilities are able to formulate kind of what I call well-channeled systems of finance, so that the financiers know how and when to finance that sort of project, and the financiers don't yet know how to finance distributed energy resource projects. So what New York is trying to do then is to change, I call it overcoming the capital expenditure bias, to kind of transform the utilities revenue streams in a way that distributed energy resources don't kind of conflict with the old model. So let me see what we can do here. I'm going to skip here to a slide here at the end. REV is reforming the energy vision. I'm just going to blow through. These are all the orders that they are doing in New York in order to try to reconfigure their utility system. So there's one, revising utility revenue streams. So now in New York, instead of getting paid for capital expenditures, they're going to get paid for coordinating diverse contributions to the grid, right? So they're not just selling anything, they're coordinating your contributions. There's distributed energy plans. They got to do those plans that I think Bill spoke about earlier. They're modifying their low to moderate income programs, and that's where I do my work. They've adopted a clean energy standard. There's community net metering. I heard some people during the break complaining about how the anaerobic digesters, they wouldn't get paid enough from by the utilities, right? Community net metering is probably the system where we make sure that those contributions to the grid are paid fairly. Community choice aggregation, that's an ugly term for the solar gardens. So that's how you're going to get solar gardens in New York, and you can't do that in Wisconsin right now. There's an order resetting the retail energy service provider market. Complicated, I'll skip it. Establishing a cost-benefit analysis framework. So Gary was talking about those cost-benefit analysis framework his master's students are doing. They are actually doing those in New York. There's a green bank to help on the financing side for distributed energy resources. And then there's a revaluing of the contributions from your solar to the grid. And then there's energy efficiency portfolio. So it's a very extensive program of switching over the old system to the new system. And one of the really cool things, this is the program that got REV off to a start. There's a Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Project. I got the acronym spelled here wrong. But what happens, there's a substation in this area. It would have cost about $1 billion to replace, $1 billion. And so, that looks like a really big capital expenditure. And so ComEd's first instinct is to replace it. There's a couple of very well or fairly well financed energy groups in New York, PACE and in NRDC, and they are ready immediately to pounce on this opportunity and say there is a better way to get the energy resources we need without doing a $1 billion expenditure. And in fact, it seems to be working quite well. What the New York Commission said is, okay, rather than doing this $1 billion capital expenditure now, we're going to put it off into the future. And instead, we're going to give you $2 million, $2 million instead of $1 billion, and you're going to use that money in order to do demand side management on the other side of the substation. So you don't need to replace the substation as soon as you thought you did, or maybe not at all. And then you can take that $2 million and you can put it in your rate base. Right? So this means that the utility is getting paid for its work, and it also means that on the other side of the substation, the distributed energy resources, they're getting economic value out of it also. So what are some of the programs that they installed basically all on the other side of this substation? So commercial direct install, that's exactly what it sounds like. ComEd would hire a contractor and they would just go to all the commercial facilities on the Queens side and their side of the substation and go, hey, we'll change out your light bulbs or do energy efficiency for you, and basically make it free on the commercial side. They've got 6,500 small businesses, 131 gigawatt hours of energy savings. And one thing that's important here is how much of the peak is shaved off. So about 10.7 megawatts of peak is shaved off. And then you can see this is from Com Edison's most recent fourth quarter report, which was just published last day of February, 2 days ago. You can see where all those commercial enterprises are. So those could be commercial enterprises in Dodge City, in Dodge. Multifamily energy efficiency. One problem with apartment buildings is something called split incentives. So neither the landlord nor the renter have the full incentive to kind of put up the upfront money for energy efficiency, and so it doesn't get done as well. And so Com Edison is performing that kind of energy efficiency for multifamily energy buildings. So there they got 1,640 buildings, 12,000 families, 4.3 megawatt hours of load reduction. New York has a public housing authority, and so Com Edison and another couple of groups are working with that authority to basically change out the light bulbs in that public housing. So at this point, 18 public housing developments, 1.4 megawatt hours, and then they were able to kind of make this program interact with a kind of workforce development program, so 14 hires of young adults from low-income communities. There's also something called a dynamic resource auction, and then our distributed energies also being put up in Brooklyn's, Queens. And this is, I think, I've not been here, but if anyone knows this area, I'm pretty sure this is not there's a lot of buildings, a lot of shades. I don't think there's a lot of places to put photovoltaics up here, but they've got, so this is the distributed energy they've put up so far. So they've got some CHP, combined heat and power, they've got some photovoltaics, and they've got some fuel cells. And so what all that energy and efficiency and what all that behind the substation generation does is it means they don't have to change out that substation quite so much. So $1 billion. So you can think about that $1 billion substation perhaps as a transmission line, right? So if you're doing this in Wisconsin, what sort of transmission investments could you avoid or otherwise avoid? And I'll just say you're just not doing this. Like when Gary says, we got to make the economic comparison, that's the comparison we're missing out on doing. So I think that's it. Yeah, I'll just take questions later.